Hello, everyone. My name is Joseph Connelly, and today I will be discussing the Normans with you. The Normans. That's a name that invokes a certain set of images. 1066, William the Conqueror crossing the English Channel to enforce a contested claim, a great battle at Hastings, the end of Anglo-Saxon rule, and the birth of a nearly 300-year-long Norman hierarchy. It is a fantastic story, one that has etched the word conquerors intrinsically into the Norman legacy. Yet England was just one piece of that story. It is in Sicily, a historically overlooked set of campaigns that began around 999 CE, 67 years before the William's conquest, that the aspects which allowed him to succeed would become evident, uncovering not only the Normans' great abilities as conquerors, but their ability to borrow and build upon ideas which formulated their battlefield tactics, as well as their ability to weave together a multicultural patchwork of vastly different people into a cohesive and interdependent government. However, before discussing the importance of the Sicilian campaigns, it is imperative to understand the origins of the Norman people, as it had an effect on why they became an expansionist power during the 11th century. The Duchy of Normandy was founded by a Norwegian warlord named Rollo in the 10th century. Originally settling in the area of Rouen, Rollo and his forces raided the areas of the Seine River and eventually worked up the courage in 911 to assault Paris itself. The Frankish king, Charles the Simple, was able to repel this attack. However, realizing the danger that Rollo posed, decided to forge a treaty at the town of Chartres, ceding to Rollo the Duchy of Normandy in exchange for the Scandinavians converting to Christianity and swearing fealty to the Frankish crown. Over the next century, the Normans would meld into Frankish culture, adopting their language and lifestyle, yet not all of their Scandinavian traditions would die out. The Franks themselves acknowledged the Normans were a culturally distinct group within Francia, with the name Normand eventually becoming synonymous with the people of Normandy, a word that they had used to describe the Vikings in the past. Chroniclers contemporary with the period, such as Gregory Maltera, also noted that the Normans had a certain cultural drive about them. They scorned the fields of their homelands in hopes of acquiring more, thus suggesting that the Scandinavian ambition to settle new lands remained a critical cultural remnant, a driving force that pushed the Normans to expand outward, as would be the case with both Sicily and later England. Sicily, unlike England, did not start as an invasion, however. At first, it was an opportunity to find fortune on the field of battle. Southern Italy during the 11th century was as divided as it was diverse. Muslims had ruled in the island of Sicily for nearly 100 years, and petty Lombard princes governed Capua, Salerno, and Benevento. The Byzantine Greeks, meanwhile, maintained the last holdouts of imperial rule in Italy around Apulia and Calabria. It was this web of states which the Normans threw themselves into upon the outbreak of hostilities between Capua and Salerno, initially siding with the former. This suggests that the Normans were not just ambitious, they were also opportunists, understanding that southern Italy's divided nature made it a prime spot for selling their abilities as warriors. This is similar to how William the Conqueror would take advantage of England's divided attention during his invasion when at the same time, Harold Hardrada was invading to press his claim on England. William saw that the divided attention of England afforded an opportunity to be able to sail across the channel to England and attack it, while the English army was distracted trying to repel the Norwegians. As a result, there is a significant suggestion that William may have learned his strategic opportunism from the Norman experience in Sicily. An idea further reinforced as the strategic opportunism became a key factor during the invasion of Sicily. When it came time to pay the Normans for their services, the Capuan prince backed out. Frustrated, the Normans turned around and offered their services to the rival prince of Salerno. For a time, just as in Capua, this worked out. However, the Prince of Salerno, paranoid of the Normans' intentions, transferred them to a Byzantine commander named Maniches to make war against Muslim forces on the island of Sicily. The Normans fought well, conquering areas around Messina and Syracuse, critical strongholds of the Muslim forces. However, the Byzantines failed to uphold their end of the bargain. And at Syracuse, overran the city itself, dividing up the spoils and leaving very little for the Normans to profit off of. Tired of being run around with little to show for it, the Normans severed their contract with the southern Italian states, and, seizing upon the opportunity afforded by their disunity, declared rebellion in 1041, using the divided nature of those Italian states to piecemeal conquer their way throughout it, originally claiming a foothold in the land of Apulia, and over time coming to conquer the entirety of southern Italy and the island of Sicily. This is very similar to how William the Conqueror would again use the divided attention of the English before the Battle of Hastings to make his invasion, preventing the English from being able to adequately respond and allowing him to make a rather uncontested landing on England, and only being contested once the English army, exhausted from traveling from the north of England down to the south, were able to put up a resistance against him. Another aspect strategic opportunism would not be the only place that the Normans borrowed from one another. The feigned retreat tactic, which would make William's victory at Hastings famous, had its roots in the Sicilian campaigns. This was first observed at the aforementioned siege of Messina, where the Normans pulled their forces back from the siege, feigning a retreat to draw the Muslim defenders out of the city. Afterwards, after allowing them to make chase for some time, the Normans turned their heavy cavalry around and crashed into the disorganized lines of the defenders, shattering them and forcing a rout. This feigned retreat would become ubiquitous with the Normans, appearing again at Monte Peloso, where the Normans had been routed. However, by the call of a single knight, were able to rally their forces and countercharge the opposing Byzantines, securing another victory. Though it might just be happenstance that William ended up in a similar situation at Hastings, the evidence would seem to suggest otherwise, especially when considering that the royal family of the de Hautevils, who would go on to conquer the rest of southern Italy and Sicily, had direct contact with the royal family of William, meaning that they would have traded information about the ongoing Sicilian campaigns. William almost certainly drilled his troops in the tactic before the invasion of England, an idea suggested by the fact that William's troops successfully engaged in the false retreat maneuver 3 times during the Battle of Hastings. The field of battle was not the only place, however, that the Normans found success. Maintaining a stable government over various cultural groups proved quite a challenge, though it would actually be William who would be first to succeed at this. After his conquest in 1066, William would restructure the English government, creating a Norman hierarchy that maintained most of the land and wealth, but buttressed by an Anglo-Saxon shire system that gave local principalities a small amount of autonomy. William's system was imperfect. It essentially stripped all of the authority held by English nobility, inviting rebellion from the suppressed Anglo-Saxons who desired more influence. Even still, William's new Anglo-Norman kingdom would remain remarkably stable. However, when rebellion did occur, it was dealt with violently. Such was the situation with the harrying of the North, wherein William's rule was challenged due to the presence of the last Anglo-Saxon claimant in northern England. And though he managed to stamp out this rebellion, it left all of Northumbria in ruins for years to come. It would not be until 1130 CE when Roger II, son of Roger de Hauteville, would become the Sicilian king and perfect Norman pluralism. Norman Sicily was not like England. It was a patchwork of Lombards, Arabs, and Greeks. Each had a different religion, and each controlled territories that were fiercely independent and highly urbanized. Roger II could not risk one or more of these groups rebelling, and as a result needed a solution that could overcome the cultural gaps while also maintaining his rule. He turned to William's model, but more than aping it, Roger II expanded on the doctrine and creating a truly multicultural kingdom in Sicily. He recognized local governments and allowed them autonomy as William had done, but he did not cut out pre-existing administrative frameworks. Rather, Roger II adopted and incorporated Arab, Norman, and Byzantine administrative practices, weaving them into an unparalleled civil service split between 2 main bodies, the Dahona de Secretis, which handled the finances of the kingdom, and the Dahona de Berorum, which handled the local governments. Both were directly modeled and borrowed from Arab and Greek traditions. Likewise, his chamber was not controlled entirely by a Norman aristocracy, but was split among Normans, Lombards, Greeks, and Arabs. It was wildly successful, building a kingdom that was a multicultural haven in which the crossover of Arabic, Greek, and Latin ideas could thrive alongside Norman traditions. In understanding this, Norman Sicily, it can be also understood that the Normans were more than just conquerors. They were also clever leaders. They were able to, and in this way, we see the silent conquest of the Normans, the ability to overcome cultural barriers, and in places like Sicily, building off of ideas originally introduced by William the Conqueror, but using that Norman propensity for expansion for expansion on ideas to create a truly pluralistic regime. Overall, when taken together, the Norman story is a historical reminder. No person or kingdom or event stands alone in history. William's conquest was built on decades of cultural influence. The documented ambition and strategic opportunism of the Normans, coupled with the cavalry tactics they developed over decades in the field of Sicily, laid the groundworks on which his invasion would succeed. William certainly had his own impact on Norman history, both in how he conducted his invasion and structured his government. However, even that would be expanded upon, perfected to create a truly multicultural Norman society. William is important, but like any great historical figure, he is a product of the society that created him, and only by looking at the wider view of Norman history can the full impact be understood.
Thank you, Joe. Good morning. So my topic is on the explanations of the French role in the Holocaust. Julian Jackson wrote in the epilogue of Dark Years, "It is easy enough to describe the official memory of the war, but difficult to know how universally it was endorsed. The idea that there was ever a consensus around the myth is probably a myth itself. Collective memory is tricky because it's usually flawed, and the collective memory surrounding the Holocaust is no different. Most are familiar with Germany's part in the Holocaust, but what is less known is the part that France played. As this topic became more frequently discussed, so did the question of where the line was drawn when it came to blame a country's position on the war, and how it was justified. The rationale for France's role in the Holocaust has been explained in three ways. France had always been anti-Semitic and used the Holocaust as a way to rid the country of the Jews. France was under a lot of pressure due to Germany's occupation and had no choice but to participate, or that the Holocaust had never actually happened. The first explanation that can be made for France's role in the Holocaust is that they had always been anti-Semitic and used the Holocaust as an opportunity to expel the Jews from the country. David Carroll writes that Vichy anti-Semitism was a French invention within the Catholic Church and actually not due to Nazi occupation. In 1940, Vichy France began to pass anti-Semitic legislation that excluded Jews from everyday life. The first Jewish statute prohibited Jews from holding most kinds of public office and later excluded them from more notable professions. The second statute was also more specific in defining what it meant to be considered a Jew or French by creating the position of the General Commissariat for Jewish questions. Although there were many anti-Semitic laws during the war, it was never France's intention to exterminate the Jews. Richard Vinin, author of The Unfree French, Life Under Occupation, argued that Vichy aimed to exclude Jews from public life rather than to kill. In order to be considered French, citizens had to prove this, or at least prove that they were not Jewish. And Xavier Vallat created the statute that defined Jewishness in regards to the French. Vallat did not believe Jews could become French, but he did make some exceptions. When it came to the First World War, the French were very sentimental, and Vallat, who claimed to be a very proud patriot, knew that there would be an uproar if he did not make special circumstances or exceptions. On the grounds of special circumstances existing in France and the mentality of the French people, driven by a very rigorous sense of justice, Vallat agreed that Jewish war veterans should be exempt from the anti-Jewish statute. Along with families who had lived in France for longer periods of time, they were able to receive exceptional status, and they were called native Jews. During this time in France, Jews were divided into native and foreign Jews, which also had social and cultural lines. Because of these differences, they were treated differently. Native Jews were generally integrated into French society and able to obtain that exceptional status, but when deportations first began in Vichy France, they were exempt from the deportations. However, later they were included. What's more is that at liberation, it was found that about 30,000 native Jews had remained in Paris during the war completely undisturbed. Along with the idea of longstanding anti-Semitism is the fact that the French themselves were involved in the arrests and deportations and internments of the Jews. When arrests were first made, they were carried out by French policemen. After being arrested, Jews were then taken to Drancy, a mass transit camp located in Paris, before being taken to Auschwitz. Drancy was run by French policemen and was the most notorious camp in Paris. The conditions of Drancy were so bad that Germans actually authorized the release of almost 1,000 sick inmates due to the lack of space and clothes and food. And Drancy was just one of the many camps in France, and while some of them housed one type of prisoner, Jackson argued that almost all camps were at some time or another used to intern Jews, and some were used uniquely for this purpose. France may not have genuinely wanted to exterminate the Jews, but according to Vinen, their measures did not function independently of each other. At the end of the war, France had a burning desire to bury this chapter of its history, and as a result, there was a lot of censorship. A 1962 French film had to have changes before it could be released, and a 1971 film was not allowed to be televised, with the reason behind it being that certain myths are necessary for people's well-being and tranquility. France did not want to rehash its role in the war. They simply wanted it to be forgotten and move on. What is more is that the French people did not initially apologize for their part in the Holocaust, which only added to the credibility that they were an anti-Semitic country, and felt no remorse for what they did. It was only in 1995 that a French leader formally acknowledged the part that they played in the Holocaust for the first time, and even then it was not met with universal approval from the French people. The second explanation that can be made is that while the Holocaust did happen, France was under a lot of pressure from the Germans and had no choice but to participate. While the argument can be made that the French assisted in arresting and deporting Jews because of their anti-Semitism, it can also be made that they had to participate because there was no other choice. In 1940, after the invasion of Germany, France became an occupied zone, and they were then thrust into the middle of Germany's plans. Manfred Gerstenfeld, author of Multiple Distortions of Holocaust Memory, argued that there were 11 ways in which the memory could be distorted. One of these ways was Holocaust deflection, which means admitting the Holocaust happened, but denying the complicity of specific groups in it, even if there was ample evidence of their involvement, and even uses France as an example. A key player in the rationale of not accepting blame was Maurice Papon, who repeatedly defended his actions as simply doing his job and following orders. Papon was the Secretary General of the Gironde Prefecture, and the general consensus is that Papon was not a major player, but because some of them, like René Bousquet, were no longer alive, Papon was essentially taking their place. Papon was implicated in 8 of the 10 convoys, which included over 1,500 Jews, and Papon was not convicted until 1998, but because of his age, he was not required to stay in detention during his trial, which caused a lot of protest, and some argued that his victims were not given the same courtesy, so he should not be allowed this either. An interview conducted by Annette Levy-Willard in 1996, Papon downplayed his role and believed that he had no reason to be blamed for anything. Every question asked was returned with him playing a lowly part, and that it was the higher-ups who made the decisions and not him. When asked about his part at the prefecture at Bordeaux, Papon said there were 2 completely separate departments, one of which Xavier Vallat ran, and one that was purely administrative, which is where he was located. When asked about his role in the convoys that transported Jews from Drancy to Auschwitz, his reply was that they only knew about Drancy, and even went on to describe he and his coworkers as helpless onlookers. Papon attempted to rationalize other actions and stated that he replaced German police with French policemen to escort the convoys, and that he also replaced cattle cars with passenger cars. Papon fully believed that he was not a collaborator and that he was doing the right thing for his country. Another key player was Xavier Vallat. Carroll writes that Vallat presented himself first and foremost as a loyal French patriot. Vallot was the Commissioner of General Jewish Affairs in Vichy and was known for the statutes put in place during the war that prohibited Jews from jobs in public places, as well as how to define oneself as truly French or Jewish. However, during his trial, Vallot denied the claims that were made that he was a racist and that he only did what he thought was in the best interest of France and no one else. Vallot also reasoned that his solutions were more humane and also efficacious than the violent solutions proposed by vulgar, irrational French anti-Semitics and the Nazi occupiers themselves. Vallot showed clear signs of anti-Semitism in the laws he created, but attempted to deny his guilt and instead showcased his apparent good deeds during the Holocaust. When it was all said and done, he did not care about the Jews, but did what he could for his country. The last explanation for the role that France played was that they did not play a role in it because it did not actually happen. Gerstenfeld defines Holocaust denial as the rejection of the main facts of the extermination of the Jews in World War II. Holocaust denial began immediately following the end of the war, and much of the denial itself came from France. Justin Johnson wrote in his article on French historians on the Holocaust that along with a long-standing pattern of anti-Semitism, there had also been a long-standing tradition of negationism. Maurice Bardeschi was the first to do this and is considered to be the father of Holocaust denial. During the war, Bardeschi was a professor of literature, and after the war, he attempted to defend Vichy's reputation and claimed that witnesses and documentation were unreliable. According to Ian Barnes, author of I Am a Fascist Writer, Maurice Bardeschi, ideologist and defender of French fascism, Bardeschi stated that one of the reasons for his beliefs about Jews and the war was that he believed the Jews forced France into an unwinnable war against Germany, but there was no proof. Another well-known Frenchman who denied the Holocaust was Paul Rassinier. Rassinier was a member of the French resistance during the war and was arrested and interned at multiple concentration camps. After the war, Rassinier wrote about his experiences, but found few sources, and the sources he did find were from those who had first-hand experience in the camps, which he thought was unacceptable. Rassinier believed that these sources greatly exaggerated the camps and the treatment of prisoners, and that life in the camps was hard but not impossible to survive. Rassinier argued that he had never seen a gas chamber and did not know anyone who had disappeared that was not found or later accounted for. Rassinier had asked about the gas chambers, and because he felt he had never received a satisfactory answer, he entered into an argument that he developed for the rest of his life. However, just like Bardeschi, Rassinier provided no real backing of evidence and simply chose to base his entire argument on his own personal experiences, which made his argument invalid. Robert Farrison was also a professor of literature and a specialist in archival research. According to the author in Crosscurrent, French Historians and the Holocaust, Farrison claimed that he had visited multiple camps, did copious amounts of research, and came to the conclusion that the gas chambers used to exterminate Jews had not actually existed. After publishing his findings, he was accosted and lost his position at the university. In later years, there were other incidents of denial at the same university, and because of this, the French Minister of National Education appointed a commission in 2001 to investigate the university and the incidents that had taken place. One final Frenchman to be discussed was Louis Darcourt del Pellepoix. Pellepoix was the successor to Xavier Vallot as Commissioner of General Jewish Affairs. According to Carroll, Pellepoix was described as vulgar, violent, pro-German, racist propagandist who seemed to accept no restraints on what he would do and what he felt France should do to assist Nazis in Germany. Venden described Pellepoix as a more violent anti-Semite and one whose rhetoric more closely matched that of the Nazis. After the war, Pellepoix fled the country to evade capture, and during a 1978 interview, he stated that the Holocaust was a hoax and only lice were gassed at Auschwitz. Along with the others discussed, Pellepoix never provided any information on the claims he made, once again making his argument invalid. There were many others who claimed the Holocaust did not happen, but because of the time constraints, it's not possible to list all of them. But the question that burns more than that is why? The motives for Holocaust denial vary, and Gerstenfeld sums them up very nicely. He summarized the motives into 4 categories: political reasons, anti-Semitic or anti-Israeli reasons, absolving ancestors of guilt, and copycatting. When considering France, perhaps the third motive seems to fit the most. France had always been a very proud country, and at times they struggled with their identity as a nation. By attempting to deny the Holocaust, it absolved their citizens of any national or personal guilt, and Gerstenfeld fittingly writes, "If all are guilty, then no one is guilty, and this could not be a more perfect reason for France to free themselves from their guilt." As a result of the rising claims that the Holocaust did not happen, France passed the Gay-Saw Act in an attempt to stop its citizens from making such false and offensive statements. And perhaps a way to make amends for their involvement. In an article from the Jerusalem Post, a previous law was created in the early 1970s, but it was difficult to enforce and gave too much leeway to many forms of communal and religious discrimination. A new law, the Gay-Saw Act, was later passed and received backlash for it. Jean-Marie Le Pen, a right-wing extremist, protested, saying that this law would kill their freedom. The law eventually passed, though, and banned not only negationism of the Holocaust, but anti-Semitism and racism as well. It is possible to speculate that perhaps racism was included due to the Jews, but maybe it was also included as a way to apologize to others in France that they had wronged during the war, such as the colonial soldiers. There will never be a way of knowing this, but it is certainly plausible. So in closing, there were many ways in which the war and the Holocaust were remembered, but it seems that France attempted to explain its roles in 3 specific ways, with that being that it was always a country that did not want the Jews to integrate into French society and had to do what they had to get rid of them, that they had no choice but to participate, or simply denying the Holocaust itself. However, due to the rising numbers of Holocaust denial, the Gay-Saw Act was put into place with hopes of ridding the idea that it was okay to make such bold statements. In Jackson's epilogue, he writes about a journalist, Henry Amoureux, who wrote a 9-volume history of France under occupation, and that his account offers neither heroes or villains, only an immensely complicated tragedy in which everyone had their reasons. The moral seems to be that to understand everything is to forgive everything. This might be a somewhat contradicting statement, but because reasons do not equal rights, there must be someone in the wrong. But there may be some truth to this, as it simply does not make it possible to understand everything. And so, there does need to be some blame, because without blame, there's no accountability. However, this does not mean that those involved cannot make amends and move on with the intent to know better and, in turn, do better, because it's always possible to do better. Thank you.
All right, so a path to destruction. Happy topic. So our topics actually segue so much. I'm so glad that you got a chance to talk about it. I thought it was so interesting. So start us off. Something that is often missed in the American education system is the French role in World War II. As kids, when we learn about it, we think of Captain America and a war that was characterized by good versus evil, where the lines are clear and distinct. But when we look deeper, we see an incredible nuance, especially pertaining to France's complicated role in the war, one that encompassed free France in a fight for liberty, and one that showed a clear rise in anti-Semitism and a collaborative role in the Holocaust, especially with the occupied zone in Vichy France. But how did the very same country, encompassed by the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Jewish emancipation, get to a place of harsh anti-Semitism? Today we're going to discuss France's path to destruction. So to help us kind of understand what our direction here is, we have mainly 5 different points that we'll be talking about. For the sake of our 10-minute presentation, I will be keeping it a little short. I do want to give the disclaimer, though, that since we are starting at the Enlightenment, I do want to say that anti-Semitism far more precedes at that point in time. So we are starting with the Enlightenment, and then we're going to the 19th century and looking at government approaches in France and how they kind of contrasted with what the message was with the Declaration of the Rights of Man. And we'll talk about public discourse and the Dreyfus Affair near the turn of the century, the interwar period, and then overall the. Okay. So start our presentation off, the era of Western history that began with the French Revolution ended in Auschwitz. The emancipation of the Jews was reversed in the most horrendous way, and that's said by Andrew Hertzberg, an amazing scholar on the subject. So with the Enlightenment period and the Jewish stratification, by the time of the French Revolution in 1789, the Jewish population reached nearly 40,000 in France. And at that time, we saw a lot of different communities that were created in the Jewish community. And Ben Bassa and Andrew Hertzberg both talk about a group of nations that existed in France, especially with talking about the Northern Ashkenazi and the Portuguese Sephardic Jews. And I really hope I'm pronouncing that right. So basically what we see is with the Ashkenazi brethren, we see a lot more of a conservative, Orthodox Jewry, whereas with the Portuguese Sephardic Jews, we see more of a liberal approach, and oftentimes they were much more accepted in society because of their more liberal viewpoints. So yeah. So conceptualizing the new French state. We have so many different points. I do see that I do have a typo on my presentation. Voltaire did not write the same thing as Montesquieu. It would be a little weird. But so basically with conceptualizing the new French state, we have different degrees of support across the board for different thinkers of the Enlightenment. And that's something that really struck me also as an American, because we have our entire Constitution, Western thought, is predicated on much of what happened in France. And when we look at these different philosophers, we see with Montesquieu and his, I'm not going to try, but you can read it. There you go. Okay, so in 1748, we see this, like, he did have a defense of the Jewish people, but he kind of simultaneously had a lot of harsh remarks also. To reference a few of these, we can see, let me see here. So for instance, he did defend the burning of a young Jewish woman at the stake in one of his writings in 1748, quote unquote, "If you do not want to Christians at least be human, you will be cited as the evidence that they were barbarous, your contemporaries the object of hatred." So, yet despite this event, he also spoke harshly and critically of the Talmud and viewed Jewish orthodoxy as, quote unquote, more foolish than other religious convictions, and naming this as, quote unquote, less evolved than Christians. Yeah. So, and then with Voltaire, we also see that he's an advocate of anti-religious militantism, and his main rebuke for the Jewish population was their contribution in the formation of Christianity. So he just hated religion, period. But particularly for Jews. In his Dictionnaire philosophique, in his 118 articles, they have virulent attacks against the Jews, such as it's also evident in his Sermon du Rabbin Akib, where he calls them infamous usurpers, where they burnt people at the stake and they were guilty of cannibalism. Now, yeah, these speak to some of the really negative stereotypes that we see even into modern day. And yeah, they were espoused by the Enlightenment thinkers. So, as Arthur Hertzberg observed, Voltaire in his essay on tolerance accepted the Jews from the principle of universal toleration. Thus, even in his request for tolerance, layered anti-Semitism was present. So, in looking at the period of the Revolution and the Terror, however, there was not a targeted nor systematic approach to hurting the Jews. While their places of worship were burned and Jewish life was halted, Protestant and Catholic churches were also victims of the violence. So arguably, the violence inflicted on religion was a byproduct of the anti-religious sentiments that were inspired by the Enlightenment thinkers' ideas on religion, who displayed quote-unquote anti-Semitic tendencies, I think that's putting it lightly, and wanted religion to be done away with. However, this disdain for religion as a whole does not erase the clear contempt shown in Enlightenment documents created by the philosophers. Rather, the argument could be made that anti-Semitism was written into the creation of modern France and is sewn into the fabric of Western thought. So, Now we're entering into the 19th century. So following the formal acceptance of the Jewish population in 1791, with Duport's motion that Jews cannot alone be excluded from the enjoyment of these rights prescribed by the Constitution, and the accompanying L'Assemblée Nationale's granting of equal rights for Jews under France, it predicated the idea that anti-Semitism was beginning to be a thing of the past, with those Jews who joined in the wave of assimilation decrying lingering anti-Semitism as, quote unquote, a time lag, and from the archaic belief that the world was finally making progress in moving past. This is in alignment with Hannah Arendt's argument on eternal anti-Semitism, and it was thought to be regarded eventually as a relic of the past. Not quite. So instead of the men of the Enlightenment and Revolution, so we see this reversal, and Jews are like, oh, wow, we're getting our rights, and they're really optimistic going into this next century. But instead of the men of the Enlightenment and the Revolution excitedly welcoming the Jews into the fold of the free man, instead they continued to debate the decision years after. This is definitely seen in the 1808 infamous decree, which restricted Jewish loans, voided debt owed to Jews by non-Jews, and limited residency of the Jewish population. And in time, it weakened the financial situation of many Jews, creating a hierarchy in France and French society. Following the introduction of the, I believe it's pronounced consistoire, which was a government-installed system for religions in France, was also used to control and regulate Jewish life through organization and representation, which continued until 1905, almost 100 years. So post-1850, though, much of the later half of the 19th century consisted of active assimilation of Jewish constituents with a largely peaceful existence in society and government. So we see this this period of kind of quiet, where there were some Jews, especially from the South, who were able to integrate earlier and quicker, because circumstances evolved by the 1850s to not only include the wealthy sect of the Jewry, as having achieved assimilation, with many relocating to Paris. So, yeah. So, but we still see, because we talked about the Ashkenazi in the previous section, we still see that they are still kind of pegged as like outsiders, and located in rural towns, they focused on strengthening private communities and largely stayed to themselves. So we see a changing landscape. I really wanted to point out a few of these points real quick. We see the Jewish population grew from 71% from 1808 to 1861. And with 1861, Paris was home to 26% of Jews. We see this rise of the middle class in the 1870s, with this, in which they later became the target of a lot of scrutiny and stereotypes that reinforced the perception of, quote unquote, all Jews are rich, in a new wave of modern anti-Semitism. It's also important to recognize that the Depression was going on between 1879 and 1896, which did fuel a lot of aggression, and did cause a lot of frustration with viewing them as taking jobs and different things like that. So, which exasperated anti-Semitism. So, onward to, sorry about that. Onward to the Dreyfus Affair, the infamous Dreyfus Affair. So Alfred Dreyfus was a French artillery captain with a Jewish background. He was arrested and convicted in 1894 of treason and sentenced to deportation and life imprisonment. As it was a highly public and highly contentious trial, the issue really divided people and served as an illustration of revived anti-Semitism in France. It was alleged that Dreyfus betrayed France and was communicating with the German embassy and sharing military secrets, and despite this, Dreyfus fiercely protested his innocence. With new evidence, believe it or not, in 1896, it actually did reveal the culprit that was responsible, but he was later acquitted. Fraudulent charges were brought against Dreyfus again in 1899, and it resulted in public outcry. Dreyfus stood trial, and the public was divided in two primary groups. the Dreyfusard and the anti-Dreyfusard, those who believed in his innocence and those who believed him to be guilty. The final pardon and reinstatement into the French military didn't come until 1906, 10 years after Dreyfus was initially arrested. Yet, despite his official pardon, the debate surrounding his innocence never truly ended. In turn, questions have plagued historians for years surrounding why it was so deeply divided France in the first place. The implications of the Dreyfus affair display how it ignited a reemergence of the Jewish question and continuities of anti-Semitic discourse, of latent anti-Semitism in French society. In equal terms, as much as Dreyfus was defended in publications, he was also ridiculed and denounced. However, with the onset of World War I, it shelved the debate, and the Jewish community largely limited public attention to their community, with many identifying themselves as quote-unquote French first and Jews second, which largely protected them. Many went to war for France in World War I, and the 4 years of the war remained largely without incident for the Jewish population. However, the aftermath of the war did demonstrate a culmination and manifestation of modern anti-Semitism. So we will quickly go through the rest. Basically, with the interwar period, we see a massive migration shift with open borders in France. In fact, one scholar called it the premier nation of asylum in the world. We see 200,000 Jews arrived in France within the span of about 33 years, 70,000 in Paris by 1930, and many of these new immigrants didn't really try to assimilate. 80% spoke Yiddish, and it kind of showed this kind of independence away from French society. And with Hitler's rise as Führer in 1934, it exacerbated tensions. It grew fears of a war with Germany, and many people started to give in to xenophobia and anti-Semitism. And we see the rise also of more newspapers and political parties that espoused this. So the aftermath, it came really quick. We see displaced Jews fleeing Nazis by 10% from 1939 to 1940. They were later placed in internment camps, as Rose talked about too. And the fall of France in 1940, it really preempted this this time in which Vichy later reversed naturalization the same way that the occupied zone did, only months before. So, unfortunately, many Jews were deported to concentration and death camps. From 1942 to 1944, 75,721 Jewish people, 23% of all French Jews, were sent to concentration camps and death camps throughout Europe from France, and only 2,500 survived. So to conclude, as we look at all of the warning signs, we see that there was an impending disaster, and with many issues pertaining to many French citizens viewing Jews as Jewish first, French second. There's a lot of dangers that lie with apathy, and hopefully as scholars we can further understand the elements of anti-Semitism in the democratic state to better prevent the progressive formation of elements favorable to mass genocide. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our panel. Thought-provoking papers. We have time for a couple questions. If I see any raised hands, I will go ahead and call on you, and then make sure you wait for the microphone before you ask your question.
I remember. It's been so long since Professor Reiner's opening remarks, remember? That asking questions is a way to honor the father. So, great.
Fantastic presentations. This particular question is directed to Joseph. So I'm interested if you have any knowledge about any other kind of remnants of Norman society in throughout the European continent. For instance, in as late as 1850s in the Balkans, British travelers were referred to as Franks. And I was wondering if you had any other instances where this kind of like remnant of Norman presence existed that late.
Well, unfortunately, my research didn't quite get into a lot of the later periods like that, and so I'm not quite sure if in a lot of places that sort of Norman identity survived, aside from England, which still has some, some minor references back to the Norman period, such as the shire system and how it was set up then, still existing today. However, it is noteworthy that Sicily maintained a distinct culture of multiculturalism throughout the medieval period, well after Norman rule had collapsed in southern Italy. The Hohenstaufen dynasty, who would later take up after the Normans, maintained that sort of idea of bringing in ideas from the different Greek and Arabic and and Christian groups that occupied the land that they had inherited.
I have a question as I wait for the recording microphone. Thank you very much for all three papers. They're great, and I have a question to those dealing with the Holocaust. It's interesting how we go from a diverse Norman French vision to having one of French nationalism. And I'm curious, to what extent did you find that Zionism arose as kind of Jewish nationalism? At the same time, you have the rise of this French nationalism growing up in the late 19th century, especially after the Franco-Prussian War.
I think that I know that I can speak for, especially in the interwar period, there was a rise of Zionism at that time, just because there was like a lot of dueling, how do I say this? A lot of dueling factions where a lot of the new immigrants that came and that were flooding France at that time, like I said, many didn't want to assimilate. So that there was kind of a push back against a lot of the anti-Semitism that was on the rise in the 1930s. So that was kind of my perspective. I hope I answered your question a little bit. But
So from what I remember of my research, I know that there was one point where they started making rules against where Jews could go or the jobs they could hold. And I know at one point when they were talking about how they defined who was Jewish or who was French or what they were more so of, there were some Jewish citizens in France who, even after knowing that if you were declared to be Jewish, that you weren't welcome, and they decided to make that declaration instead of, oh, I live in France, I'm French, I'm a French citizen, because they were so proud of who they were and were willing to face concentration camps or deportation or whatever because of that.
Somebody else wants to. Okay, Schuster and I are going to take it. First of all, again, awesome papers. So great to see you all. And Elizabeth, you did a lot of extra research from when you wrote that paper the first time, so that was neat. Just a quick aside to Dr. Schuster. Theodore Herzl, the founder of modern Zionism, was actually a journalist in France covering the Dreyfus Affair. And so a lot of people talk about Zionism being born of this particular moment that you did a nice job of talking about in French anti-Semitism. So I also thought it was really neat how your two papers combined. And so I'm going to ask two questions, and you can both decide who wants to answer them or answer both of them. So the first question connects, again, both of your papers, and I thought that Rose did a nice job of pointing to three possible explanations for French participation in the Holocaust. And it seemed to me that Elizabeth picked the first one, which was the French have always been anti-Semitic, and they were just kind of waiting for this opportunity for someone to say, hey, I've got a place you can send all your Jews here, and we'll get rid of them for you. So that, was Rose started off as this is one of the possible explanations. So I guess the first question, based on Elizabeth's paper, is, are either of you convinced by that explanation? Do you think that's the explanation that you would go with, that that's why the French participated in the Holocaust, that they just had this latent anti-Semitism the whole time? And then I want to turn to the second explanation that Rose presented, which was that this was war. France was under occupation. The Nazis were in charge. They were the ones who came up with the idea of the Holocaust, and they were the ones that wanted to see it through. And the French didn't have any choice in the matter, because they would have been shot. So first of all, the first question is to ask you both personally, based on your research, which of those two explanations you find more convincing. And then the second question, again, came out of Rose's paper, which I always grapple with, and we kind of talk about a lot in this class and other classes, is what if you think the choice of how you answer the first question matters. So thinking about national memory and thinking about how as a nation you recover from such a horrible experience as war and occupation and genocide, and if the stories that a nation tells themselves are important for allowing that nation to move forward. So you can answer it thinking about France, or you can think about, certainly our own country has made many, failures, errors, whatever you want to call them in the past. Is it important as a nation to admit to our failures, to admit to our errors, to call them what we call them, and to move forward? Or, as Rose, you said, that a lot of French people thought during the Holocaust or during the years afterwards, by banning movies and not putting things on TV, is it sometimes better for a nation to not stir up the bad memories again? So apologies, that was a giant question, but I would love to hear your thoughts on how you'd answer.
I won't make you go first twice. I actually liked all of those questions. I had a lot of thoughts swirling in my head, and I'm like, oh, I hope I can remember all of these. But for your first question, which was the first explanation that I had, is that they'd wanted to get rid of the Jews. So I feel like I feel two ways about that. Like, I did see a lot of things that made me think that maybe that was the kind of their ultimate goal, just given the history and some of the laws and the statutes and all of that. But kind of going back to your other question about the second explanation, they were in a war, and so they were kind of caught in the middle. But the other thing that I didn't mention in my paper that I actually took out was that this was not the first time they were in occupied zone. It happened in World War I as well, and the French citizens were not treated well at that time. And so I think that sparked a lot of fear about what's going to happen this time, or what if we just kind of go along with it, maybe we'll be spared as a country. But ultimately, I think that it's hard to pick one reason or explanation, because just thinking about like my own personal experiences and even my job right now that I have that I really like, it's I've learned that it's not possible to have one reason. It's never black and white, and there's going to be layered reasons. So yeah, it could be a lot of people were anti-Semitic, but it could also be that they lived through the First World War and they didn't want to see that happen again, and so they were like, well, okay, well, if I play along, then maybe my family and I will be spared. Maybe we won't have all of the things happen to us that we did in the First World War. So I can't remember if that answered all of your questions, but that was kind of my thinking behind it.
Yes, the national moving forward question too. Maybe Elizabeth can take up that.
Yeah, that is such a hard question. Because I've thought about this even in our own society and culture because but I have to believe that in our I have to believe that in a free society that we have to be free to be able to talk about the things that we've done wrong. And I think that's part of history. I think that's part of how important studying history is. So in order to fix what was wrong in the past, we have to talk about it, and we have to really just full on approach it. So that is I guess that's such a simple way of answering, I guess, but it's very nuanced at the same time. And with your first question too, I've thought a lot about whether or not, because my paper does argue that anti-Semitism was present, that things were going to happen no matter what, and I do believe that. However, you also have to think about what World War I did to France and how terrifying that must have been for those people. And that's not to take away anything from what happened in World War II, but I do think that we can't ignore that nuance. So I hope
That was why I included the last part of my paper. I know it was hard trying to decide what to cut, but I really wanted to keep that last sentence about how it doesn't mean that they can't pick up the pieces and move forward and try to know better and in turn do better, because it's always possible to do better and rebuild. I mean, there's been lots of other countries that have gone to war with other people for lots of reasons, but in the end, somehow or another works out, and then they move forward and they go forward, they try to learn and do better the next time. So that's kind of why I decided to keep it in there, because, I mean, I only kept 3 reasons for their justifications, but there were a lot of other reasons. And going back to what I had said about how it's not a black and white thing. There's so many things that go into making that decision, and I really wanted to stress that.
I think some really good thoughts about legacy and memory that can apply broadly to places all over the world. And thank you all so much for your papers today. If we can give another round of applause. And after a couple minutes, we'll have our final panel for the day.